You have to understand something fundamental about the avoidant psyche. Control is not just a preference for them. It's a survival strategy. It's how they regulate anxiety, how they maintain a sense of identity, how they avoid the chaos they associate with emotional dependence. So when they meet an empath, someone who is open, emotionally attuned, deeply present, it doesn't feel safe at first. It feels like a threat. Because the empath doesn't play by the same rules. They don't hold back in calculated ways. They don't engage in emotional games. They lean in, they listen, they see, and most importantly, they feel not just their own emotions, but the unspoken emotions of the avoidant as well. And that level of emotional awareness can feel almost invasive to someone who has spent years, sometimes decades, mastering the art of emotional distance. So what happens? The avoidant mistakes safety for danger. They interpret the empath's consistency as pressure. They interpret emotional availability as neediness. They interpret depth as intensity that must be escaped. And because their internal wiring tells them that closeness leads to loss of control, they pull back. Not because the connection isn't real, but because it's too real. And here's the paradox. What feels overwhelming in the moment becomes unforgettable in hindsight. Because while the avoidant is distancing themselves, something else is happening beneath the surface. For perhaps the first time, they are experiencing a kind of connection that isn't transactional, isn't superficial, isn't based on performance or independence. The empath offers something they're not used to, emotional safety without conditions. And even if they reject it, even if they walk away, their nervous system registers it. They may not have the language for it. They may not consciously acknowledge it, but they feel the difference. And later, this is where it gets interesting when they enter other relationships that are more aligned with their comfort zone, more distant, more controlled. Something feels off. It's easier, yes, less demanding, less exposing, but it's also flatter, less alive. Because once you've experienced genuine emotional safety, even briefly, it leaves an imprint, and that imprint doesn't fade easily. So the very thing they ran from becomes the thing they start to crave. Not in the same intense way, but in a quieter, more reflective way. They begin to realize that what they once labeled as too much was actually something rare, something real, something they didn't know how to receive at the time. This is why avoidants often look back and reassess the empath differently than they experience them in the moment. It's not that the empath changed. It's that the avoidance perception evolves once the threat to control is no longer immediate. Distance creates perspective, and perspective reveals truth. So when you're trying to make sense of why an avoidant would reject something that was clearly meaningful, you have to stop looking at it through the lens of logic and start understanding it through the lens of protection. They didn't reject you because you were wrong for them. They rejected the experience because they didn't yet have the capacity to feel safe inside it. And the moment they begin to develop that capacity, even slightly, that's when the memory of you shifts. That's when confusion turns into clarity. And that's when they realize the safest thing they ever felt was the very thing they once ran from. Now, once you begin to understand that dynamic, you can start to see rejection through a very different lens, because what most people do, especially empaths, is they personalize it. They take someone else's inability to stay, to open, to meet them at depth, and they turn it into a statement about their own value. They ask, what did I do wrong? Why wasn't I enough? And that question, while human, is fundamentally misguided in this context. Because when an avoidant pulls away, it's not a verdict, it's a limitation. It's a reflection of where they are emotionally, not a reflection of who you are. And this is where psychological maturity becomes critical, because without it, you'll try to solve a problem that was never yours to fix. You'll shrink your needs, dilute your intensity, make yourself more digestible, all in an unconscious attempt to fit inside someone else's capacity. But capacity doesn't expand because you minimize yourself. If anything, it reinforces the very dynamic that caused the disconnection in the first place. Avoidants don't reject love because it's absent. They reject it because it exceeds what they know how to regulate. Think about that. If someone has spent their life equating closeness with vulnerability and vulnerability with loss of control, then real intimacy doesn't feel comforting. It feels destabilizing. So when an empath shows up with depth, presence, and emotional consistency, it creates an internal conflict. Part of them is drawn in, because at a human level, we all want connection. But another part of them is activated, signaling danger, urging distance, pushing them back toward what feels familiar. Independence, detachment, self-reliance. And in that internal tug of war, protection almost always wins, at least initially. So they withdraw. Not because the connection lacked meaning, but because it had too much meaning for where they were. And this is the nuance most people miss. We assume rejection equals disinterest, but in avoidant dynamics, rejection often coexists with attachment. It's not the absence of feeling, it's the inability to sustain it without triggering defense mechanisms. And if you don't understand that, you'll misinterpret everything. You'll think, if they cared, they would have stayed. But the truth is, caring isn't the issue. Capacity is. Emotional availability isn't just about desire. It's about regulation. It's about whether someone can sit inside connection without feeling like they're losing themselves. And for an avoidant, that's not something that develops overnight. It requires awareness, discomfort, and a willingness to confront patterns they've relied on for years. So when they walk away, what they're really saying, whether they realize it or not, is, I don't have the tools to hold this right now. And that has nothing to do with your worth. But here's where it becomes transformative for the empath. When you stop internalizing rejection, you stop chasing validation. You stop trying to prove that you're lovable, because you recognize that love was never the missing piece. The connection existed. The depth was there. What was missing was alignment and emotional readiness. And that shift changes everything. Because instead of waiting for someone to grow into you, you begin to honor where you already are. You stop negotiating your standards to accommodate someone else's limitations. And paradoxically, that's the moment you step into real power. Not the power of control, but the power of clarity. You see people for who they are, not for who they could be. And in doing so, you free yourself from cycles that were never meant to sustain you. So if you take anything from this, let it be this. Rejection from someone who lacks the capacity to receive you is not a loss. It's a misalignment revealing itself in real time. And once you understand that, you stop asking, why wasn't I enough? And start realizing you were simply too real for where they were. And once that separation happens, something subtle but powerful begins to unfold inside the avoidant, something they often don't even consciously recognize at first. Because while they've moved on physically, emotionally, the story isn't finished. In fact, in many ways, it's just beginning. You see, human beings don't evaluate experiences in isolation. We evaluate them through comparison. Every new connection is measured, consciously or unconsciously, against what came before. And when an avoidant has experienced an empath, someone who offered depth, presence, and genuine emotional attunement, that experience doesn't just disappear. It becomes a reference point. It becomes the benchmark. Now here's where the psychology gets interesting. Avoidants tend to gravitate toward relationships that feel manageable. Connections that don't demand too much emotional exposure, where they can maintain a sense of autonomy and control. On the surface, these relationships feel easier. There's less tension, less vulnerability, less perceived risk, but there's also less depth. And at first, that trade-off feels worth it. It feels safe, predictable, contained. But over time, something starts to surface, a kind of quiet dissatisfaction that's hard to articulate. Nothing is necessarily wrong, but something is missing. The conversations don't quite land the same way. The emotional resonance isn't as strong. The connection, while functional, lacks a certain aliveness. And that's when the comparison begins. Not always in a dramatic, conscious way. It's not like they're sitting there thinking about the empath every day. It's more subtle than that. It shows up in moments when they're with someone who doesn't quite understand them, when they feel unseen in a way they didn't before, when they realize that what they once had required no explanation, no translation. Because with the empath, there was an intuitive connection. They felt understood without having to over-explain. They felt seen without having to perform. And even if that level of closeness once triggered discomfort, it also created something rare, emotional resonance that's difficult to replicate. So now, every new connection is filtered through that memory. And here's the paradox. The very depth they once rejected becomes the standard they can't seem to find again. This is why avoidants often experience a delayed emotional response. In the moment, they prioritize safety over connection. But with time, as the emotional intensity fades and their defenses relax, they begin to reassess. They start to recognize that what they walked away from wasn't ordinary. It wasn't replaceable. It wasn't something you can easily recreate with just anyone. It had substance. And once you've experienced substance, surface level connection doesn't satisfy in the same way. Now, this doesn't mean they immediately come running back. That's a misunderstanding of the process. Awareness doesn't always translate into action. There's still fear, still ego, still the same internal patterns that caused them to leave in the first place. But internally, something has shifted. The narrative has changed. The empath is no longer seen as too much. They're seen as the one who felt different. And that distinction matters because it marks the beginning of emotional recognition. It's the point where the avoidant starts to understand that what they experienced wasn't pressure. It was connection. It wasn't overwhelming. It was unfamiliar depth. And in that realization, a kind of quiet longing begins to form. Not always strong enough to override their patterns, but strong enough to stay with them. Strong enough to influence how they see relationships moving forward. Strong enough to remind them again and again that something meaningful existed and that they may have let it go before they truly understood its value. So when you step back and look at this dynamic as a whole, it becomes clear. The empath doesn't just leave a memory, they leave a standard. And once that standard is set, it reshapes everything that comes after. Because no matter how far the avoidant goes or how many connections they experience, there's always a part of them that knows what real depth felt like. And once you've felt that, you can't unfeel it. And this is where the dynamic takes an unexpected turn. Because what couldn't be understood in closeness often becomes undeniable in distance. While the empath is present, the avoidant is operating in real time inside the intensity of connection. Their nervous system is activated, their defenses are engaged, and everything feels immediate. There's no space to reflect, only a constant need to regulate, to manage, to maintain control. So even something healthy can feel overwhelming in that state. But once the empath steps away, once the messages stop, the presence fades, the emotional pressure dissolves, something shifts internally. The environment changes, the urgency is gone. And for the first time, the avoidant is no longer reacting. They're observing. Absence creates a kind of emotional silence, and in that silence, clarity begins to form. Because without the empath there to trigger their defenses, the avoidance system calms down. The very thing that once felt intense is no longer pressing against them. And paradoxically, that's what allows them to finally process it. What they couldn't feel safely in the moment, they begin to feel in retrospect. And this is a critical distinction. Insight often comes after the experience, not during it. So now, instead of interpreting the connection through the lens of fear, they begin to see it through the lens of memory. And memory has a way of filtering out the noise and highlighting what mattered. The conversations that felt grounding. The moments they felt understood. The emotional safety they didn't have to earn. And slowly, almost reluctantly, the narrative starts to change. What once felt like pressure begins to look like care. What once felt overwhelming starts to look meaningful. And what they once convinced themselves they needed to escape starts to feel like something they may have misunderstood. This is the power of absence. It removes the immediate threat and replaces it with perspective. But here's where it becomes even more profound. In the absence of the empath, the avoidant is also confronted with something they can't avoid anymore: contrast. Because now, it's not just about what they felt, it's about what they don't feel elsewhere. Other connections may be easier, but they don't carry the same emotional weight. They don't create the same sense of being seen, of being met at depth. And that contrast sharpens awareness. It forces a kind of internal comparison that wasn't possible before. Not because the empath was trying to prove anything, but because their absence reveals what their presence once provided. And this is why distance is often more impactful than persuasion. You can't argue someone into clarity, but you can give them the space to arrive at it on their own. Now, does this mean every avoidant suddenly has a breakthrough and changes? No. Growth still requires willingness. It requires self-awareness, accountability, and the courage to face uncomfortable truths. But what absence does is plant the seed. It introduces the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the connection they walked away from wasn't the problem. Maybe their interpretation of it was. And that realization, even if it's quiet, even if it's delayed, is powerful because it disrupts the old narrative. It creates space for a new understanding. And once that understanding exists, it's very difficult to go back to complete emotional detachment. So when you think about distance, don't see it as loss. See it as revelation. It's the moment where illusion fades and truth begins to surface, not through force, but through absence. Because sometimes the only way someone can truly see what you meant to them is when you're no longer there to show them. And even as that clarity begins to form, there's another layer operating beneath the surface, one that explains why the shift isn't immediate, why recognition doesn't instantly lead to action, Because before the heart can fully acknowledge what it feels, the ego steps in to protect what it believes is at risk. For the avoidant, the ego isn't about arrogance, it's about defense. It's the internal structure that says, stay in control. Don't depend, don't need, don't lose yourself in someone else. And that voice has been reinforced over time, often through experiences where vulnerability felt unsafe, where closeness led to disappointment, or where emotional needs went unmet. So the ego builds a narrative. I'm better off alone. I don't need this. I'm fine. And in the moment of connection, that narrative is loud. It overrides subtle emotional signals. It reframes intimacy as intrusion. It convinces the avoidant that pulling away is not only justified, it's necessary. But here's what's fascinating. The ego can suppress emotion, but it can't erase it. Because while the avoidant may move on externally, internally, the experience is still being processed. Not consciously, not in a way they can easily articulate, but at a deeper emotional level. The body remembers what the mind tries to rationalize away. The nervous system holds on to the imprint of safety, of connection, of being seen in a way that felt different. And over time, as distance creates space and the immediate need for defense fades, the ego begins to quiet down. It's no longer reacting to a present threat, so its grip loosens. And in that quiet, something else starts to emerge. The heart, not in a dramatic, overwhelming way, but in subtle moments. A memory that lingers longer than expected, a feeling that surfaces without warning, a realization that what they experienced wasn't ordinary. And because the ego is no longer dominating the narrative, these moments aren't immediately dismissed, they're felt. And this is where the internal conflict begins to shift. Because now, instead of the ego saying, you're better off without this, there's another voice, quieter but more honest, saying, that meant something. And that voice doesn't operate from fear, it operates from truth. It begins to connect the dots. It recognizes that the sense of calm they once felt in the empath's presence wasn't weakness, it was safety. That the emotional depth they once resisted wasn't overwhelming, it was unfamiliar. And that the connection they walked away from wasn't something to escape, it was something they didn't yet know how to hold. This realization doesn't come all at once. It unfolds gradually, often in contradiction to their established identity. Because to admit that they lost something meaningful requires them to confront the very vulnerability they've been avoiding. It requires them to question their patterns, their choices, their sense of control. And that's uncomfortable, but it's also transformative, because once the heart is allowed to speak without being silenced by the ego, the avoidant begins to access a different level of awareness, not just about the relationship, but about themselves. They start to see the cost of their defenses. They begin to understand that protection, while necessary at one point, may now be limiting their ability to experience something deeper. And in that awareness, something powerful happens. Longing. Not the kind of longing driven by loneliness or lack, but the kind that comes from recognition. The kind that says, I felt something real before, and I can't pretend I didn't. And that changes the internal landscape. Because now, the avoidant is no longer just protecting themselves from pain. They're also aware of what they might be missing. And that tension between protection and desire becomes the space where growth is possible. So when you look at their journey, understand this. The ego may lead in the beginning, but it doesn't have the final say. Over time, as defenses soften and awareness deepens, the heart begins to reassert itself. And when it does, it doesn't shout. It reminds. It reminds them of what was real, what was felt, and what still matters beneath all the layers of control. Because in the end, no matter how strong the defense, the truth has a way of resurfacing. And when it does, the heart doesn't ask for permission, it simply asks to be heard. And then we arrive at the moment that changes the entire dynamic, the point where everything you've understood so far begins to converge into something tangible. Because up until now, the empath has been present, available, leaning in, trying to understand, trying to hold the connection together. And in doing so, even with the best intentions, they've been participating in a pattern the avoidant unconsciously relies on. Because as long as the empath is chasing, the avoidant never has to confront the absence. They never have to feel the full weight of what it means to lose something real. Because on some level, they trust it will still be there. Maybe not consciously, but energetically. There's a sense that the connection can be revisited, that the door isn't fully closed, and that sense of availability allows them to stay in control, to keep distance without experiencing true separation. But the moment the empath stops, truly stops, not as a tactic, not as a strategy, but as a shift in self-respect, that's when the entire structure collapses. Because now, the dynamic is no longer being sustained from one side. The messages don't come. The emotional presence isn't there. The quiet understanding they once had access to is gone. And for the first time, the avoidant isn't managing closeness. They're experiencing absence, not as an idea, but as a reality. An absence, when it's real, doesn't negotiate. It doesn't explain itself. It doesn't reassure. It simply exists. And in that space, something unfamiliar begins to happen. The avoidant, who once leaned away to create distance, now feels the distance without control over it. And that lack of control is what activates a different kind of awareness, because now it's not about protecting themselves from being overwhelmed. It's about confronting what's missing. And this is where the emotional shift begins. Not instantly, not dramatically, but internally. They start to notice the silence, the lack of connection, the absence of someone who once understood them without effort. And because there's no longer a presence triggering their defenses, their system is calm enough to actually feel the impact of that loss. This is the paradox. When the empath was there, the avoidant felt pressure. When the empath is gone, they feel the void. And the void is harder to ignore because it doesn't ask for vulnerability, it creates it. It forces them to sit with questions they didn't have to face before. Why does this feel different? Why does this absence linger? Why does no one else quite match that connection? And in asking those questions, they begin to engage with their own emotional reality in a way they previously avoided. Now, this doesn't mean they suddenly transform into a fully open, emotionally available